Hi, welcome back to another episode of Thinking Inside the Box on Noah's Ark. You may have seen a previous video on 5 analog workflow tips. Well, today we're going to do the complete opposite, and I'm going to share 5 tips in the digital domain and how we can, make use of the modern DAW technology to enhance our productions. So let's get started. So tip number 1, record in 48 kilohertz. The human ear, as you know, has a frequency range of 20 hertz to 20 kilohertz. And many people wonder, why do we need a sampling rate higher than 44.1? Because, as you may know, the Nyquist theorem states that if you want to sample a certain frequency, you need double that frequency rate in order to capture without aliasing problems. Technically, you'd only need a sample rate of higher than 40 kilohertz. In order to remove those aliasing frequencies when we sample, the converter is going to apply a low-pass filter. If you think about 44.1 kilohertz, well, the highest frequency you can capture is 22.05. The frequency range that the low-pass filter has to operate is of roughly 2000 hertz, which could be quite steep for low-quality, poor converter. So if you record in 48 kilohertz, well, if you divide that by 2, well, that means that the highest sample that you can capture is of 24 kilohertz. So you have actually 4000 hertz to produce that filter slope, and that's going to be less costly and less expensive to manufacture. So just to be on the safe side, if you record in 48, then you can make sure that even if you have poor converters, then they can successfully filter out the higher frequencies. So tip number 2 is limiting with a ceiling of minus 0.5 dBFS. So when you're sending a mix to a client, you want to make sure that the file is at an appropriate level in order to the client to be able to compare and reference with other commercial recording. The problem with keeping the ceiling at 0 dBFS is that although you're preventing any samples to go above 0 dB full scale, you can have a couple of problems with that. So first problem is that many digital platforms and many conversions that occur after the exporting of your mix, such as uploading to SoundCloud or creating an MP3 file or sending it to iTunes, well, they're going to do processing afterwards, and that processing can possibly boost the signal. That's going to make it that the new converted file will indeed clip later on. There's a second problem also, which is called the inter-sample peaks. If you have a ceiling of 0 dBFS, you're going to have sample points limited to 0 dBFS, but you have the values in between those samples that could project over, and that is only something that you can hear in the analog domain. So maybe the speaker is going to clip when trying to reproduce that sound. If your limiter plugin has an inter-sample peak detection, then you're safeguarded from that problem. So tip number 3 is dithering to 16-bit. So I hope most of you guys probably record in 24-bit to have maximum dynamic range when capturing the audio signal. When you send the mix to a client, you probably reduce the bit depth to 16-bit. Or when you mix for CD, well, then you're going to set the sample rate to 44.1 and the bit depth to 16-bit. But when you lower the word length, well, you can have something of a quantization noise, as we call it, in the quieter bits of the songs. Dithering is this random noise that's added to hide those quantization errors that are occurring. Then you're going to ask me, what does noise shaping do? Well, noise shaping is basically an EQ that's applied to the dither noise in order to make it less audible to the human ear. So according to the Fletcher-Manson curves, we know that certain frequencies are more perceivable to the human ear than others. There are 3 types mainly of noise shaping. There's type 1, which is more suitable for solo instruments or small ensembles. Type 2 is mainly good for rock and pop music in general. And type 3 is more for orchestral performances, where there's a lot of dynamic range going on. Tip number 4 is what I call the Bobcat's bounce trick to 32-bit float. Tip number 4 is something I learned while talking to mastering engineer Bob Katz and renowned writer for his book called Mastering Audio, the Art and the Science. Nowadays, people worry about clipping and headroom when mixing. So a lot of mastering engineers will ask you to have as much headroom as possible. And this is due to the fact that in 24-bit, you have a certain limit that you cannot go over before the signal gets clipped. But there is a trick around that, is that the internal architectures of DAWs nowadays are built in floating point computation. So it's going to be either 32-bit float or 64-bit float. So all the processing in your channels and your auxes and your sends are going to be calculated in floating point. So there's no actual clipping in the summing of the different buses, but the place where it can clip is in the master output. So what you can do is that usually you cannot read different audio files with different sample rates, but you can read different audio files in the same session that have different bit depth. So when you do the bounce, you set the bit depth to a 32-bit float. Then you're going to be able to capture all that essence of your mix without losing any of the detail. The advantage of that is that you don't even need to worry about headroom, because 32-bit float computation, well, has virtually infinite headroom that you can work with. And it's really hard to clip unless you have millions of tracks running at the same time. If you do an internal bouncing at 24-bit, then the information is truncated right there. So even if you bounce after that stereo file to 32-bit float, the information is already lost. So make sure if you're doing internal bouncing, change the session settings to 32-bit float. So that's the Bobcats bounce trick, and I'd like to thank Bobcats for that invaluable tip. Tip number 5 is how to mix with headphones. I often find myself mixing in different environments and not always having the same set of monitors or familiar setup that I'm used to. So I end up mixing with headphones, which are the ones that I'm most familiar with. And there's this plugin that I recently acquired, and which is really useful, I think. It's called the SonarWorks reference plugin. And what it does is that you can select the headphones you have, and it does have database of impulse responses. So it knows what the general frequency response of that headphone is. So what it's going to do is it's going to apply a correction EQ depending on the set of headphones you have, and you can have a target frequency response that you can choose. So if you want a flat frequency response, you can have that, and you can also choose some of the famous monitoring system out there. So you can have Yamaha and stands or B&W speakers, to name a few. So that's really useful when you're not in the environment you're familiar with, but still want to have the same frequency response to get a good sense of what frequencies you need to cut and boost. So that's the SonarWorks Reference 3 plugin. So here you go, 5 digital workflow tips for the modern DAW user. So if you liked the video, please like it and subscribe to my channel. Let me know in the comment section below if you have any additional digital tips that you'd like to share with us. And I'll see you next time for another video.